John Parker had been living in the same house for 11 years. It was a modest two-bedroom property on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California. Nothing special by any measure. The mortgage was manageable but tight, and the salary from his job at the local hardware store barely covered the essentials. Every month felt like a balancing act between bills, groceries, and the occasional unexpected expense that would throw everything off course. He wasn't struggling in the dramatic sense, but there was no room for error, no cushion for emergencies, and certainly no savings to speak of. His wife, Linda, worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental clinic. Between them, they earned just enough to stay afloat, but dreams of vacations, home improvements, or even a newer car remained firmly out of reach. They had accepted this rhythm as their reality. Life wasn't bad. It was just predictable, limited, and defined by careful choices. The house itself had character, though not always the good kind. Built in the 1940s, it had the quirks of an older property. The floors creaked in certain spots, the plumbing occasionally groaned, and the basement, or what John called the cellar, was a space they rarely used. It was dark, damp, and cluttered with boxes they had never bothered to unpack after moving in. Linda had suggested organizing the cellar more than once, but John always found a reason to delay. There was always something more urgent, more pressing, more worthy of attention. The cellar remained a forgotten space, a repository for things they didn't need but couldn't quite throw away. Old furniture from the previous owner still sat there covered in dust. Cardboard boxes with faded labels lined the walls. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light that barely reached the corners. Then, in early spring, the water heater started acting up. It was one of those problems that couldn't be ignored. The showers turned ice cold without warning, and the pilot light kept going out. John tried to fix it himself, watching a few tutorial videos online, tightening valves and checking connections, but nothing worked. Calling a plumber would cost money they didn't have set aside, so he decided to take a closer look at the unit in the cellar, hoping for a simple solution he could manage on his own. He descended the narrow wooden stairs with a flashlight in hand. The air down there was always cooler, almost stale, with a faint smell of earth and old concrete. The water heater sat in the far corner, surrounded by stacks of forgotten belongings and old furniture they had inherited from the previous owner. As John approached the unit, he noticed something odd. The floor near the base of the heater seemed uneven, slightly raised in a way he hadn't noticed before. He crouched down, running his hand along the concrete, and felt a distinct ridge, a seam that shouldn't have been there. At first he assumed it was just settling, the natural shifting of an old foundation, but the more he looked, the more deliberate it seemed. The seam formed a rough rectangle about 3 feet by 2 feet, and when he tapped on it with his knuckles, the sound was different, hollow. He stood up, staring at the spot, trying to make sense of it. Why would there be a hollow section of floor in the cellar? Had the previous owner done some kind of repair work? Was there a drainage issue underneath? John grabbed a flathead screwdriver from his toolbox and worked it into the seam, prying gently. The concrete was old and brittle, and after a few minutes of effort, a chunk broke free. Underneath, he saw wood, old, dark wood, stained and weathered. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a repair. This was something else. He cleared away more concrete, revealing what looked like a wooden cover or hatch, embedded in the floor and sealed over with a thin layer of concrete at some point in the past. He pulled harder, and the wooden cover shifted. It was heavy, but it came loose with a groan of old nails and warped boards. When he finally lifted it away, he found himself staring into a shallow cavity, maybe 2 feet deep, carved directly into the earth beneath the foundation. And sitting in that cavity, covered in dirt and grime, was a metal box. A safe, old, rusted at the edges with a tarnished combination lock on the front. John's breath caught. He reached down and pulled the safe out, surprised by its weight. It was roughly the size of a small suitcase, maybe 20 inches wide and a foot tall, with a dull grey surface that had once been painted black. The lock mechanism was corroded, and the metal showed signs of moisture damage, but the safe was intact. He set it on the floor, wiping away the dirt with his sleeve, and stared at it. Why would someone bury a safe under the cellar floor? What could be inside? His mind raced through possibilities. The house had been owned by an elderly man before John and Linda bought it. The man had passed away, and his estate had sold the property through a realtor. There had been no mention of anything left behind, no family coming forward to claim belongings. John had always assumed the old furniture in the cellar was just junk the estate didn't bother to remove. But this was different. This was hidden, deliberately concealed, and meant to stay that way. He tried the combination lock, turning the dial randomly, knowing it was pointless but unable to resist. The lock didn't budge. He considered his options. He could try to force it open, but the safe was solid, and he didn't have the tools for that kind of work. He could call a locksmith, but that would mean explaining the situation, and he wasn't sure he wanted anyone else to know about this yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. John carried the safe upstairs and set it on the kitchen table. Linda was at work and he was alone with his discovery. He spent the next hour searching online for information about old safes, how to open them, what they might contain. The results were a mix of advice, warnings, and anecdotes from people who had found similar items in attics or basements. Some had contained nothing of value. Others had held old documents, jewelry, or cash. A few stories mentioned items worth thousands of dollars, life-changing finds that had been hidden for decades. He decided to wait until Linda got home before making any decisions. When she walked through the door that evening, he led her to the kitchen without a word and pointed at the safe sitting on the table. She stared at it, confused, and then looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He explained everything: the water heater, the uneven floor, the buried cavity, the safe. She listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to cautious excitement. Linda asked the same questions he had asked himself. Where did it come from? What's inside? Should they call someone? John admitted he didn't know, but he felt strongly that they should open it themselves before involving anyone else. If it turned out to be nothing, they would have wasted time and energy. If it turned out to be something valuable, they needed to understand what they were dealing with before making it public. Over the next few days, John researched locksmiths who specialized in antique safes. He found a man named Richard, based in Fresno, about an hour and a half away. Richard's website showed decades of experience with old locks and safes, and his reviews were overwhelmingly positive. John called him, explaining that he had found an old safe in his house and needed help opening it. Richard asked a few questions about the age and condition of the safe, then agreed to come out the following weekend. He quoted a fee of $300, which felt steep but necessary. The days leading up to Richard's visit felt endless. John found it hard to focus at work, his mind constantly drifting back to the safe sitting in his kitchen. Linda seemed equally distracted, and they spent their evenings speculating about what might be inside. Old coins? Jewelry? Cash from decades ago? Or nothing at all, just papers and personal items with no monetary value? The uncertainty was maddening, but there was also something thrilling about it, a sense that their lives might be on the verge of changing in ways they couldn't yet imagine. When Saturday morning arrived, Richard showed up in a white van filled with tools and equipment. He was a man in his 60s, calm and methodical, with the demeanor of someone who had seen it all. He examined the safe carefully, running his fingers along the lock and checking the hinges. He explained that the safe was likely from the 1930s or 40s, based on the design and materials. The combination lock was corroded, but not beyond repair. He estimated it would take him about an hour to open it without damaging the contents. John and Linda stood nearby, watching as Richard worked. He used a stethoscope-like device, listening to the internal mechanisms as he slowly turned the dial. He made notes on a pad of paper, testing different sequences, adjusting his approach based on what he heard. The process was painstaking, and the tension in the room grew with each passing minute. Finally, after nearly 90 minutes, Richard smiled and pulled the door open. Inside, the safe was lined with old fabric, now stained and deteriorating. Resting on that fabric were several small pouches, each one tied closed with frayed twine. The pouches were made of dark leather, cracked and brittle with age, and they looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Richard stepped back, letting John reach inside. John picked up the first pouch, surprised by its weight. He untied the twine carefully, and when he opened the pouch, he saw stones, rough, unpolished stones, ranging in size from a pea to a marble. They didn't look like much at first glance, just irregular chunks of translucent material, but there was something about them that caught the light in an unusual way. Linda leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked if they were glass. John shook his head slowly. He didn't know what they were, but they didn't feel like glass. They felt heavier, denser. He opened another pouch, then another. Each one contained similar stones, all rough and uncut, all varying in size and clarity. There were at least a dozen pouches in total, and the combined weight was significant. Richard, still standing nearby, asked if he could take a look. John handed him one of the stones, and Richard held it up to the light, turning it slowly. After a long pause, he said it looked like a diamond, a rough diamond. John felt his heart hammering in his chest. He asked Richard if he was sure. Richard explained that he wasn't a gemologist, but he had seen enough stones over the years to recognize the basic characteristics. The way the light refracted through it, the weight, the texture, it all pointed to diamond. He suggested that John take the stones to a certified gemologist as soon as possible to get a proper evaluation. If they were real, and if there were as many as it appeared, they could be worth a considerable amount of money. After Richard left, John and Linda sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the open pouches and the stones spread out before them. They counted them carefully. 47 stones in total, ranging from small fragments to pieces the size of a walnut. Some were clear, others had a cloudy or yellowish tint, but all of them had that same unusual quality, that strange way of catching and bending light. John felt a mixture of excitement and fear. If these were real diamonds, their lives were about to change in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. But if they weren't, if this was all some elaborate mistake or misunderstanding, the disappointment would be crushing. He spent the rest of the weekend searching for gemologists in California. He found several in Los Angeles, but the drive was over 2 hours, and he wasn't sure he wanted to travel that far with something potentially so valuable. Eventually, he found a certified gemologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez, based in Bakersfield itself. Her credentials were impeccable. She had worked with auction houses, insurance companies, and private collectors for over 20 years. Her office was in a secure building downtown, and she offered appraisal services by appointment only. John called her office first thing Monday morning. The receptionist asked a few questions about the nature of the appraisal, and when John explained that he had a collection of rough stones he believed might be diamonds, she scheduled him for an appointment later that week. John took the day off work, telling his manager he had a personal matter to attend to. He didn't mention the stones or the safe. He didn't want to jinx anything, and he certainly didn't want rumors spreading before he knew what he was dealing with. The night before the appointment, John barely slept. He kept thinking about the possibilities, the sheer magnitude of what might be sitting in those leather pouches. He had done enough research to know that rough diamonds could vary wildly in value depending on size, clarity, color, and a dozen other factors. Some rough stones were worth a few $100s per carat. Others, especially large or exceptionally clear stones, could be worth tens of thousands per carat. If even half of the stones in his possession turned out to be valuable, he and Linda could be looking at a sum that would eliminate their financial worries permanently. On the day of the appointment, John packed the pouches carefully into a backpack, placing each one in a separate Ziploc bag for added protection. He drove to Dr. Vasquez's office, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The office was located in a nondescript building with a security desk in the lobby. He checked in, provided identification, and was escorted to the 3rd floor. Dr. Vasquez met him in a small conference room with bright overhead lights and a large magnifying lamp on the table. She was a woman in her 50s, professional and direct, with an air of quiet confidence. She asked John to explain how he had come into possession of the stones, and he told her the truth. He had found them in a safe, buried in his cellar, left behind by the previous owner. She nodded, making notes, and then asked him to show her the stones. He unpacked the pouches one by one, laying them out on the table. Dr. Vasquez put on a pair of magnifying glasses and picked up the first stone, examining it under the lamp. She worked in silence for several minutes, turning the stone, checking its surface, holding it up to the light. Then she set it down and picked up another, and another. The process continued for nearly an hour, and John sat quietly watching her face for any sign of reaction. Finally, she removed her glasses and looked at him. She said that the stones were indeed diamonds, rough, uncut diamonds, and based on her preliminary examination, they were of significant value. John asked her to be more specific. "Doctor," Vasquez explained that providing an exact valuation would require more detailed analysis, including testing for clarity, measuring each stone precisely, and assessing potential yield after cutting. However, based on what she had seen so far, she estimated that the collection as a whole could be worth several $1,000,000, possibly more. She recommended sending the stones to a specialized laboratory for full certification, which would take a few weeks, but would provide an official appraisal that could be used for insurance or sale purposes. John felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Several $1,000,000. The words didn't seem real. He asked if she was certain, and she assured him that while the final number would depend on the detailed analysis, her initial assessment was sound. These were real diamonds, and they were valuable, very valuable. She also warned him about the legal and financial complexities that would follow. Depending on how the diamonds were acquired originally, there could be questions about ownership, taxes, and reporting requirements. She advised him to consult with a lawyer before making any decisions about selling or disclosing the find. John thanked her and left the office in a daze. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the backpack in the passenger seat. His phone rang. It was Linda asking how the appointment went. He told her they needed to talk, and he would explain everything when he got home. The drive back felt surreal. Everything looked the same, the streets, the buildings, the people going about their daily routines. But for John, the world had shifted fundamentally. When he got home, he sat Linda down and told her what Dr. Vasquez had said. Her reaction mirrored his own. Disbelief, followed by shock, followed by a cautious, tentative excitement. They spent the evening talking through the implications. If the diamonds were worth millions, they would need to figure out how to handle the situation legally and safely. They would need lawyers, accountants, security. They would need to decide whether to sell the diamonds or hold on to them, and they would need to understand the tax consequences, which could be enormous. Over the next few weeks, John followed Dr. Vasquez's advice and sent the diamonds to a gemological laboratory in New York. The lab was one of the most respected in the country, known for its rigorous certification process. The wait was agonizing. Every day felt like a week. John continued going to work, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, but his mind was elsewhere. Linda tried to stay grounded, reminding him that nothing was certain until they received the official report, but even she couldn't hide her nervous anticipation. Finally, the report arrived. John opened the envelope with trembling hands and read through the technical language, the detailed measurements, the clarity grades, the classifications. At the bottom of the report was a summary. Total estimated value of the collection, based on current market conditions and projected yield after professional cutting, was $13,800,000. John read the number 3 times to make sure he wasn't misreading it. 13.8 million. He showed the report to Linda, and they both sat in stunned silence. The number was almost incomprehensible. It represented more money than they had ever imagined possessing in their entire lives. It was enough to pay off their mortgage instantly, buy new cars, travel the world, invest for retirement, help family members, and still have millions left over. But it also represented a massive responsibility. They couldn't just walk into a jewelry store and sell $13 million worth of diamonds. The process would be complex, lengthy, and fraught with legal and financial hurdles. John reached out to a lawyer who specialized in estate and tax law. The lawyer, a man named Thomas Grayson, explained that the diamonds would be considered found property, and under California law, John had a legal claim to them, as long as he had made a reasonable effort to identify and contact any rightful owners. Since the previous owner of the house had passed away, and the estate had been settled, and since there were no living relatives or outstanding claims, the diamonds were legally John's. However, they would be subject to federal and state taxes. Thomas walked John through the tax implications. The diamonds would be treated as ordinary income in the year they were sold, which meant they would be taxed at John's marginal income tax rate. Between federal and California state taxes, the total tax burden could be as high as 40 to 50%, depending on how the sale was structured. That meant John would net somewhere between $7 and $8 million after taxes. Still an enormous sum, but significantly less than the gross value. Thomas also advised John to work with a specialist dealer or auction house to sell the diamonds. Selling rough diamonds required expertise and connections in the industry. A reputable dealer could ensure that John received fair market value and could handle the transaction discreetly and securely. Thomas referred John to a dealer in Los Angeles who had decades of experience with high-value stones and a reputation for integrity. The dealer, a man named Samuel Klein, visited John's home to inspect the diamonds in person. He brought portable equipment to verify the certifications and examine the stones under controlled lighting. After spending several hours with the collection, Samuel confirmed that the gemological report was accurate. The diamonds were legitimate, and the valuation was sound. He offered to broker the sale through his network of private buyers and institutional clients, taking a commission of 5%. Given the size and complexity of the transaction, John agreed. The sale process took nearly 4 months. Samuel worked with buyers in New York, London, and Hong Kong, presenting the collection to clients who specialized in rough diamonds. Some stones were sold individually, others in small lots. The buyers were primarily cutters and dealers who would transform the rough stones into polished gems for jewelry. Each transaction required extensive documentation, certifications, and secure shipping arrangements. Samuel kept John informed throughout the process, providing regular updates on offers and negotiations. By the end of the year, every stone had been sold. The total proceeds came to just over $13,700,000, slightly below the appraised value, but within the expected range given market fluctuations. After Samuel's commission and legal fees, John netted approximately $12,900,000. Then came the taxes. John worked with an accountant to file the necessary paperwork and pay the required amounts to the IRS and the California Franchise Tax Board. When everything was settled, he and Linda had $7,200,000 in their bank account. The first thing they did was pay off their mortgage. The house that had felt like a burden for 11 years was now theirs, free and clear. They paid off their car loans, their credit card debt, and a small personal loan they had taken out the previous year. For the first time in their adult lives, they had no debt. Zero. The relief was almost physical, a weight lifting from their shoulders that they hadn't fully realized they were carrying. Next, they met with a financial advisor to discuss how to manage the money responsibly. The advisor recommended a diversified portfolio, a mix of stocks, bonds, real estate, and cash reserves. He warned them against making impulsive purchases or lifestyle changes that could drain their newfound wealth. He also suggested setting aside a portion for taxes on the investment income they would earn going forward. John and Linda followed his advice carefully, investing the bulk of the money and keeping a smaller amount accessible for immediate needs and discretionary spending. They decided not to quit their jobs right away. John continued working at the hardware store, and Linda kept her position at the dental clinic. They wanted to maintain some sense of normalcy, and they weren't ready to deal with the questions and attention that would come from suddenly leaving their jobs without explanation. But they did make some changes. They bought a new car, a reliable SUV that replaced John's aging sedan. They took a vacation to Hawaii, something they had talked about for years, but never thought they could afford. And they started thinking seriously about their long-term future. One of the biggest decisions they faced was whether to tell anyone about the diamonds. They had kept the entire situation private, sharing details only with the professionals who needed to know. Their families and friends had no idea. John's co-workers still thought of him as the same guy who worked the register and helped customers load lumber into their trucks. Linda's colleagues at the dental clinic had no reason to suspect that her life had changed so dramatically. John and Linda decided to keep it that way. They didn't want the attention, the jealousy, or the unsolicited advice that would inevitably come with revealing their windfall. They had heard too many stories about lottery winners whose lives were disrupted by sudden wealth, relationships strained, trust broken. They agreed to live modestly, avoid flashy purchases, and let their financial security work quietly in the background. But the knowledge of what had happened, of what they had found, stayed with them constantly. John thought about it every time he descended the stairs to the cellar, which he had since cleaned and organized. The spot where the safe had been buried was now just a patch of concrete indistinguishable from the rest of the floor. There was no visible evidence of the discovery, no marker or reminder. Yet John knew. He knew that beneath that ordinary surface, in a hidden cavity carved into the earth decades ago, someone had placed a fortune and then walked away. Or perhaps they had intended to come back and never got the chance. He would never know the full story. Dr. Vasquez had mentioned, during one of their follow-up conversations, that rough diamonds of that quality and quantity were often associated with old mining operations or private collections from the early 20th century. It was possible that the previous owner of the house had been involved in the diamond trade, either as a dealer, a cutter, or even a miner who had brought stones back from overseas. The 1930s and 40s were a time when many people distrusted banks and chose to hide their valuables at home. The safe, buried and sealed, would have been a logical choice for someone who wanted to protect their assets during uncertain times. John researched the previous owner, a man named Harold Finch, who had lived in the house from the 1950s until his passing in 2013. Harold had been a quiet man, never married, no children, few social connections. He had worked as a bookkeeper for a local manufacturing company and lived a simple, unremarkable life. There were no records linking him to the diamond industry, no hints of wealth or unusual activity. It was possible that Harold himself had never known about the safe, that it had been buried by an even earlier owner, someone whose name was lost to time. The mystery added a layer of complexity to the story. John and Linda owned the diamonds legally, but they couldn't help wondering about the person who had hidden them. What had driven them to bury such a fortune? Had they planned to retrieve it and been unable to? Had they forgotten about it? Or had they simply died before they could pass on the knowledge to anyone else? The questions had no answers, and John eventually accepted that they never would. As the months passed, John and Linda settled into their new reality. They upgraded their home, making long overdue repairs and improvements. They replaced the old water heater, the very appliance whose malfunction had led John to the cellar in the first place. They renovated the kitchen, updated the bathrooms, and added insulation to make the house more energy efficient. They did the work gradually, hiring local contractors and paying in cash, avoiding the kind of large, conspicuous projects that might draw attention. They also started thinking about their future in broader terms. With financial security no longer a concern, they had the freedom to make choices based on what they wanted, rather than what they could afford. John considered going back to school to study something he had always been interested in, but never had the opportunity to pursue. Linda talked about volunteering more, spending time on causes she cared about. They discussed the possibility of starting a small business, not because they needed the income, but because they wanted the challenge and the sense of purpose it would bring. One evening, nearly 2 years after the discovery, John and Linda were sitting in their living room, talking about how much their lives had changed. Linda remarked that it was strange how something so life-altering could come from such an ordinary moment. John had only gone down to the cellar to fix a broken water heater. He hadn't been looking for anything, hadn't suspected that anything unusual was there. It was pure chance, or perhaps something more, that had led him to notice the uneven floor, to investigate, to dig, and to find what no one else had found in decades. John agreed, but he also thought about the choices he had made after the discovery. He could have ignored the uneven floor, dismissed it as irrelevant. He could have called a plumber instead of trying to fix the water heater himself. He could have opened the safe in haste, or made reckless decisions about selling the diamonds, or spent the money carelessly. At every step, there had been choices, and those choices had shaped the outcome as much as the initial discovery. He thought about the diamonds themselves, rough and unpolished, hidden away for so long. They had held their value silently, waiting in darkness for someone to find them. And when that moment came, they had changed everything. Not just financially, but in terms of perspective, possibility, and the understanding of how quickly life could shift from one state to another. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more about discoveries that changed lives, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are so many untold stories out there and you won't want to miss the next one. Hit that like button if this story made you think about what might be hidden in your own home, in places you've never looked closely. John and Linda's story also raised questions about how many similar discoveries are still out there, waiting to be found. How many homes have hidden compartments, forgotten safes, or buried treasures that no one knows about? The previous owners pass away, estates are settled, houses are sold, and the knowledge is lost. The items remain concealed and silent, sometimes for generations. John had read about other cases during his research. A family in Arizona had found gold coins worth over $1 million buried in their backyard. A couple in England had discovered a stash of Roman artifacts while digging a pond. A man in Texas had torn down an old shed and found bundles of cash hidden in the walls. These stories were rare, but they were real, and they all shared a common thread. The discoveries were accidental, the result of routine maintenance, renovations, or simple curiosity. What set John apart was what he did after the discovery. He didn't rush. He didn't make impulsive decisions. He consulted experts, followed legal procedures, and thought carefully about the long-term implications. That deliberate, methodical approach had allowed him to maximize the value of the diamonds and protect himself legally and financially. It was a reminder that finding something valuable was only the first step. What mattered just as much was how you handled it. The tax burden had been substantial, but John had been prepared for it. He had known from the beginning that a significant portion of the value would go to taxes, and he had planned accordingly. The money he netted, while less than the gross value, was still enough to transform his life completely. And because he had managed the process carefully, he had avoided the legal complications and financial pitfalls that had plagued others in similar situations. John also thought about the role of luck versus awareness. Yes, finding the safe had been lucky, but noticing the uneven floor, taking the time to investigate, recognizing that the hollow sound meant something, those were acts of attention and curiosity. Luck had given him an opportunity, but his actions had turned that opportunity into something real. He wondered how many people walked past opportunities every day without noticing, without pausing to look closer, without asking the questions that might lead to something extraordinary. Linda had her own reflections on the experience. She thought about how easy it would have been to let fear or doubt stop them at any point. What if they had been too afraid to open the safe? What if they had assumed the stones were fake and thrown them away? What if they had sold the diamonds to the first buyer they found, without doing proper research, and been cheated out of millions? The what-ifs were endless, and each one represented a path they could have taken that would have led to a very different outcome. She also thought about the responsibility that came with the money. They had more than they needed for a comfortable life, and that raised questions about what to do with the excess. Should they give some away? Should they help family members? Should they invest in their community? These were questions they hadn't needed to consider before, and the answers weren't obvious. Wealth brought freedom, but it also brought choices, and choices required judgment. John and Linda decided to set up a small charitable fund, donating a portion of their windfall to causes they cared about. They supported local schools, food banks, and organizations that helped families in financial distress. They did this quietly, without fanfare, in the same way they had handled the discovery itself. It felt right to share some of what they had gained, to use their unexpected fortune to make a positive difference, even if only in small ways. As time went on, the intensity of the discovery faded, and life returned to a new kind of normal. The diamonds were gone, sold and cut and set into jewelry that now belonged to people around the world. The safe was gone, discarded after Richard had opened it. The cellar was clean and organized, a functional space rather than a neglected one. But the impact of what had happened remained. John and Linda lived differently, thought differently, and approached the future with a sense of security they had never known before. John still worked at the hardware store, though he had reduced his hours. He enjoyed the routine, the interactions with customers, the sense of being useful. He didn't need the job financially, but he valued it for other reasons. Linda continued her work at the dental clinic as well, finding satisfaction in the structure and the relationships she had built there. They had chosen not to let the money define them or upend their lives entirely. Instead, they had integrated it into their lives in a way that felt balanced and sustainable. One afternoon, a customer at the hardware store asked John for advice on fixing a leaky pipe in his basement. John walked him through the process, recommending the right tools and materials, and mentioned that it was always worth taking a close look at older homes when doing repairs. You never knew what you might find. The customer laughed and said he doubted his basement held any surprises, but he appreciated the advice. John smiled and nodded, thinking about the safe, the diamonds, the $13,800,000 that had been sitting in his cellar for decades, unknown and untouched, waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring them back into the world. The story of the cellar, the safe, and the diamonds was a story about more than just money. It was about attention, curiosity, patience, and the choices we make when faced with the unexpected. It was about the hidden layers of the world around us, the things that remain concealed until someone takes the time to notice, to question, to dig a little deeper. And it was a reminder that extraordinary things can be found in the most ordinary places if we're willing to look. John Parker's life had changed because a water heater broke down, because he went to the cellar to fix it, because he noticed something unusual and chose to investigate, because he opened a safe that had been buried for decades, because he handled the discovery carefully, thoughtfully, and responsibly. Each of those steps mattered. Each of those choices led to the next. And in the end, what had been hidden was revealed. What had been lost was found, and what had seemed impossible became real. If this story made you think about the possibilities in your own life, about the things that might be hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered, then take a moment to share it. Send it to someone who might appreciate it. Leave a comment about what you would do if you found something like this, and subscribe to Fortune Beneath, because there are more stories like this one, more discoveries, more moments when ordinary people stumbled onto something that changed everything. The diamonds are gone now, scattered across the world, transformed into polished gems that sparkle in rings and necklaces, and earrings worn by people who will never know the full story of where those stones came from. But John and Linda know. They know that beneath the ordinary surface of their lives, beneath the routines and the bills and the daily concerns, something extraordinary was waiting. And when the moment came, they were ready. They paid attention. They took action. And they made the most of an opportunity that could have easily been missed. That's the real fortune. Not just the money, though the money certainly mattered. The real fortune was the awareness, the willingness to investigate, the courage to pursue something uncertain, and the wisdom to handle it well. Those qualities can't be bought or sold. They can't be buried or hidden away. They're the qualities that turn luck into success, that transform accidents into opportunities, that make the difference between finding something valuable and walking right past it without ever knowing it was there. John still thinks about the person who buried the safe, whoever they were. He wonders what their life was like, what circumstances led them to hide such a fortune, what they hoped would happen to it. He wonders if they ever imagined that decades later, a man fixing a water heater would stumble across their secret and inherit a windfall beyond imagination. He wonders if they would be happy knowing that the diamonds had finally served their purpose, providing security and opportunity to someone who needed it, even if that someone was a stranger separated from them by decades. The cellar still stands, solid and quiet beneath the house. The floor shows no trace of what was once hidden there. Visitors to the home would never suspect that anything unusual had ever happened in that space. It looks like any other basement in any other house in Bakersfield, but John knows better. He knows that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that patience and attention can reveal what has been hidden, and that sometimes the simplest actions lead to the most profound consequences. Linda often thinks about the moment John first came upstairs with the safe. The look on his face, the weight of possibility in that rusted metal box sitting on their kitchen table. She remembers the weeks of uncertainty, not knowing if they had found something valuable or just an old container full of worthless relics. She remembers the day Dr. Vasquez confirmed that the stones were real, and the day the final appraisal came back with that staggering number. Each memory is vivid, preserved with the clarity that comes from experiencing something that only happens once in a lifetime. They've talked about what they might have done differently, if anything. John sometimes wonders if he should have tried to research the history of the house more thoroughly before selling the diamonds, to see if there was any way to trace them back to their original owner or understand the full story. But the trail had been cold for too long. Harold Finch, the man who owned the house before them, had left no clues, no journals, no relatives who might have known anything, and whoever had buried the safe before Harold's time was lost to history entirely. Linda thinks they handled it exactly right. They were careful, methodical, and responsible. They didn't rush into decisions, they didn't make mistakes that could have cost them legally or financially, and they didn't let the money change who they were at their core. They improved their lives without destroying them, which was perhaps the hardest balance to strike when sudden wealth entered the picture. The financial advisor they worked with told them that most people who come into large sums of money unexpectedly end up losing it within a few years. Lottery winners, inheritance recipients, and people who find hidden treasures often make impulsive decisions, trust the wrong people, or fail to understand the long-term implications of their spending. John and Linda had beaten those odds by approaching their windfall with caution and seeking expert guidance at every step. Their investments had performed well over the 2 years since the sale. The $7,200,000 they had netted after taxes had grown to nearly $8 million through careful portfolio management. They were earning more in investment income each year than they had previously earned from their jobs combined, and that income was largely passive, requiring no labor or time commitment from them. It was a level of financial freedom that most people never experience, and it had come from a discovery that took less than 5 minutes to make. John had calculated once, out of curiosity, how much time he had spent on the entire process from discovery to final payout, including the initial investigation, the appointments with experts, the legal consultations, the sale negotiations, and all the administrative work. He estimated he had invested roughly 200 hours over the course of a year. That worked out to approximately $64,000 per hour of effort, a rate of return that was almost impossible to comprehend. But he also understood that the financial calculation wasn't the full story. The real value wasn't just in the money, it was in what the money enabled. It was in the absence of financial stress, the ability to make choices based on preference rather than necessity, the freedom to help others, the security of knowing that unexpected expenses wouldn't derail their lives. It was in the peace of mind that came from having options, from being able to weather any economic storm, from never having to worry about losing their home or being unable to afford health care or watching their retirement plans crumble. They had also gained something less tangible but equally valuable, a story that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Not a story they would share publicly, but a private narrative that shaped their understanding of how the world worked, how opportunities arose, and how small moments could cascade into life-changing events. It was a story about paying attention, about being curious, about having the courage to pursue uncertain possibilities. John thought about all the times in his life when he had walked past opportunities without noticing them, when he had been too busy or too tired or too distracted to pay attention to details that might have mattered. He wondered how many other people were doing the same thing every day, missing chances, ignoring signs, dismissing unusual observations because they seemed too unlikely or too much trouble to investigate. The uneven floor in the cellar could have easily been one of those missed opportunities. He could have stepped over it, ignored it, decided it wasn't worth his time, but he hadn't. And that single decision had changed everything. Linda had her own lessons from the experience. She had learned that it was important to trust her instincts, to support John's curiosity even when it seemed like a long shot, and to approach major decisions with patience rather than impulsiveness. She had also learned that money, while powerful and enabling, wasn't a solution to every problem. It had solved their financial problems completely, but it hadn't changed their relationship, their values, or their fundamental approach to life. They were still the same people they had been before, just with more resources and more options. One of the most interesting aspects of keeping the discovery secret was watching other people struggle with financial problems that John and Linda now had the power to solve, but chose not to address directly. A co-worker of John's had complained about mounting credit card debt. A friend of Linda's had talked about postponing a needed medical procedure because of the cost. John's sister had mentioned struggling to afford her daughter's college tuition. In each case, John and Linda could have stepped in with financial assistance, but doing so would have raised questions they weren't ready to answer. Instead, they helped in smaller, less conspicuous ways. They anonymously donated to fundraisers, gave generous gifts at holidays and birthdays, and offered help that could be explained by modest savings rather than substantial wealth. It was a delicate balance, wanting to use their resources to help people they cared about while maintaining the privacy they valued. They had decided that revealing their windfall would create more problems than it would solve, at least for now. As the third year after the discovery approached, John and Linda began thinking about making some bigger changes. They had maintained their jobs and their routines long enough to establish that the money hadn't changed them fundamentally. They had proven to themselves that they could handle wealth responsibly. Now they were ready to start living more intentionally, using their financial freedom to pursue things that mattered to them rather than things that paid the bills. John decided to cut back his hours at the hardware store even further, eventually transitioning to part-time consulting work, where he helped the store with inventory management and supplier relationships. It kept him connected to the work he enjoyed, without the demands of a full-time schedule. Linda left her position at the dental clinic and began volunteering with a literacy program that helped adults learn to read. She had always wanted to do this kind of work, but had never had the time or financial flexibility to pursue it seriously. They also started traveling more, not extravagantly, but regularly. They visited national parks, explored small towns, and took the time to see parts of the country they had only read about before. They weren't trying to impress anyone or live a lifestyle that looked wealthy from the outside. They were simply doing things they had always wanted to do, but couldn't afford when every dollar had to be carefully allocated. The house in Bakersfield remained their home base. They had no desire to move, despite having the means to buy something larger or more expensive. The house had given them the diamonds, and it felt wrong to abandon it now that it had changed their lives. Besides, they liked the neighborhood, the familiar routines and the sense of continuity that came from staying in one place. Wealth hadn't made them restless or dissatisfied with what they had. It had simply removed the constraints that had previously limited their choices. John still went down to the cellar regularly, now that it was clean and organized. He had set up a small workshop there, a space where he could work on projects and repairs. Every time he walked across the floor where the safe had been buried, he thought about that day, the moment of discovery, the weight of the metal box in his hands. It was a memory that never lost its power, a reminder of how quickly everything could change if you paid attention to the right details at the right moment. He had also become more observant in general, more willing to investigate things that seemed unusual or out of place. He didn't expect to find another fortune. The odds of that were astronomical, but he had learned that the world was full of hidden layers, and that curiosity was rarely wasted. Even when it didn't lead to diamonds, it led to knowledge, understanding, and a richer appreciation of the complexity beneath the surface of everyday life. Linda had developed a similar mindset. She found herself noticing things she would have previously overlooked, asking questions she would have previously dismissed, pursuing small investigations that often led nowhere but occasionally led somewhere interesting. It wasn't about finding more money. It was about approaching life with engagement and attention, rather than autopilot and assumption. The charitable fund they had established had grown as well, funded by a portion of their investment income each year. They supported causes quietly, directing money to organizations that made a tangible difference in people's lives. They didn't seek recognition or publicity. They just wanted to use some of what they had gained to help others who were struggling with the kinds of problems they themselves had once faced. It felt like closing a circle, taking the good fortune they had received and passing some of it forward. 3 years after the discovery, John received a call from Samuel Klein, the dealer who had brokered the sale of the diamonds. Samuel explained that one of the larger stones from John's collection had been cut and polished into an exceptional gem, and the cutter wanted to know if John might be interested in seeing the finished product. The stone had been transformed into a brilliant cushion-cut diamond weighing just over 5 carats with exceptional clarity and color. It had been set into a pendant, and the final piece was stunning. John declined the offer to purchase it. He had no need for such an item, but he did ask Samuel to send him photographs. When the images arrived, John was struck by the transformation. The rough, cloudy stone that had been sitting in a leather pouch in a buried safe for decades was now a flawless, sparkling gem that caught light in a way that seemed almost magical. It was hard to believe they were the same object, separated only by cutting and polishing. He showed the photographs to Linda, and they talked about the journey that stone had taken, from wherever it had originated, possibly a mine in Africa or South America, to the hands of whoever had brought it to California, to the safe in the cellar, to John's discovery, to the gemological lab, to the dealer, to the cutter, and finally to whoever had purchased it and commissioned the pendant. Each stage had added value, transformed the stone and moved it closer to its final form. And John and Linda had been one link in that chain, the link that brought it out of darkness and back into the world. The pendant sold at auction for nearly $400,000, according to Samuel. A single stone from the collection, now polished and set, had commanded a price that would have seemed unimaginable to John 3 years earlier. It was a reminder of the total value that had been sitting beneath his cellar floor, hidden and forgotten, waiting for someone to stumble across it. As the years continued to pass, the discovery became part of John and Linda's personal history, a defining moment that divided their lives into before and after. They rarely talked about it anymore, except with each other, and even then, only occasionally. It had become absorbed into the fabric of their lives, no longer a dramatic event, but simply a fact, a piece of their story that explained how they had arrived at where they were now. John sometimes thought about writing down the full account of what had happened, creating a detailed record that could be passed on to family members or eventually made public. But he always decided against it. The story was theirs, private and personal, and sharing it would invite complications and attention they didn't want. Perhaps someday, decades in the future, someone would discover the story through estate records or financial documents. But for now, it remained a secret, known only to them and the handful of professionals who had helped them navigate the aftermath. The hardware store where John worked eventually closed, a victim of competition from larger chains and changing consumer habits. John wasn't affected financially, but he felt the loss emotionally. He had worked there for over 15 years, and it had been part of his identity and his routine. The closure was a reminder that even positive changes in personal circumstances didn't insulate you from the broader shifts in the world around you. Businesses failed, industries evolved, and life moved forward regardless of individual fortune. Linda's volunteer work with the literacy program expanded over time. She trained new tutors, developed curriculum materials, and eventually took on a leadership role in the organization. It was work that fulfilled her in ways her previous job never had, and it was possible only because she had the financial freedom to pursue it without needing a salary. She often thought about how the diamonds had enabled this work, how a hidden fortune had been transformed not just into money, but into time, energy, and the ability to make a difference in people's lives. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a trip to Europe, something they had dreamed about since their early years together, but had never been able to afford. They visited museums, walked through ancient cities, and spent time in places they had only seen in photographs. It was a trip that symbolized how far they had come, not just financially, but in terms of the choices available to them and the experiences they could now access. Throughout it all, John never forgot the lessons of the cellar. He never forgot that valuable things could be hidden in plain sight, that small actions could have enormous consequences, and that the difference between opportunity and missed opportunity often came down to whether you paid attention. He never forgot that luck was real, but that what you did with luck mattered just as much as the luck itself. The cellar, the safe, and the diamonds had given John and Linda more than money. They had given them a story about possibility, about attention, about the hidden layers of the world. They had given them proof that extraordinary things could happen to ordinary people, that fortunes could be found in the least expected places, and that careful, thoughtful action could turn a surprising discovery into lasting security. And they had given them the knowledge that somewhere out there, in cellars and attics and walls and yards across the country, other fortunes were waiting, hidden by people who had long since passed away, forgotten by heirs who never knew they existed, sitting silently in darkness until the right person, at the right moment, with the right combination of curiosity and courage, stumbled across them and brought them back into the light. John Parker had been that person. He had found what others had missed. He had turned a broken water heater into a $13,800,000 discovery. And in doing so, he had changed not just his own life, but his entire understanding of what was possible when you paid attention to the details that everyone else ignored. The story of the Cellar is a story about looking closer, digging deeper, and having the courage to pursue what seems unlikely. It's about the fortunes that remain hidden all around us, waiting for someone to notice, to question, to investigate. And it's a reminder that the most valuable discoveries often come not from searching for treasure, but from paying attention to the ordinary moments when something seems just slightly out of place and choosing to find out why.